Excellent, thank you. So the talk today, it's about the book, but I went a bit, I don't know, listening to the recent talks on the archives, I got a bit inspired or distracted or sidetracked. So this is about like writing the book and the considerations that went into it, as well as at the end, then I talk a bit about the book. But it was more about things that just really I was kind of intrigued to go back and reflect on after listening to the previous talk. So it's a bit of everything. I want to talk about my work on women murder and the death penalty in post-independence Ireland. So I want to look specifically at the book that I published last year on this, why I was interested in that topic, a bit about the process of the research and writing the book, and then a bit about the findings at the end. And I want to talk about the boundaries between the disciplines as I found it working in this space, and then some of the issues or considerations with using historical approaches to the study of crime and punishment. So it's a Meet the Author talk. I'm here to talk about the book Gender and Punishment in Ireland, which was published last year from Manchester University Press, who were absolutely lovely to work with. So it's a monograph that's over a decade in the making, as I suppose most monographs are, and as I'm hoping that my next won't be, but I'd imagine it probably will. I'm not holding my breath. The book emerged from my PhD, which was a study of all women convicted of murder and sentenced to death in Ireland after independence in 1922. So this amounted to 25 women in total, which took into account also the 3 women who had their death sentences later quashed. So that was the PhD it emerged from. And when coming to consider a proposal for a book, the number of cases discussed was expanded quite a lot. And I don't know if you've read the guidance to authors about turning your PhD into a book, but it's always like, don't tell them that it was a PhD. Never anywhere in the book should you refer to the fact that this was even remotely close to a PhD, which is insulting to what the PhD is. But and that wasn't really what motivated me. It was more 25 women, and I wanted to kind of expand that, and I was interested in kind of continuing to find out more. So the book ended up being all women who were prosecuted for murder between 1922 and then 1964. So that ended up being 292 women, which was quite the expansion of the sample, I suppose, and was an entirely new piece of research almost. Even though at its heart, the fundamentals were very much the same, the scope was just a bit different. Why did I stop in 1964? The mandatory sentence of death for murder was removed in that year in a piece of legislation. So I would either have to continue on and sever the connection with my research on the death penalty, or I retain the death penalty link and include the one woman who was convicted of capital murder after 64, even though her case was quashed. So it just seemed like it made sense to kind of take those span of years. So monograph is such a wanky word, and it's perfect for academia. And I was interested in what it meant to want to write the monograph and what that meant for your career, or what it meant for your discipline that you wanted to do that. So a 2014 Guardian article said, if you want to get ahead in the humanities, the monograph is still the thing. And that was 9 years ago, and I don't know if that's the case anymore. And I know this seems like a very back to basics beginning to a talk, but I think it's worth considering why we even write books and what the point of them is, beyond any sense of personal satisfaction that we may get from it. And of course, promotion. And I think particularly in the wordy fields where the qualitative approaches are common, there is a real sense that it's the only format where you can really get into talking about your research and your work. It's really expansive. It allows for detail. It allows for you to put the context in as well, and it allows for all the nuance that you can't necessarily get into an article. Maybe if you're a better writer than I am and much better at succinctly putting your argument forth and editing. And it also gives a sense of ownership over an area, which isn't particularly healthy, but it's a chance to plant your flag in a certain topic, and then hope that others come along and continue to engage with what you're saying. But with reference to the boundaries between the disciplines, even within humanities and social sciences, they're more the currency in the humanities. So they're more history than they are criminology, even though criminology does have a really good tradition of monographs. So perhaps then with historical criminology, it is, of all the flavors of criminology, perfectly appropriate to have the monograph there. The sticking point, though, can be, what is it? When it comes to the publisher perspective, where does it go and how do they market it? So I wanted to take another digression and talk about historical criminology in the publishing world and where we think things should go. So one of the reasons that I was interested in this topic was because I loved Annette Ballinger's book, Dead Women Walking, from 2000, which has finally been reissued under the Routledge Revival series. So it's good to finally have a hard copy of that as opposed to just the photocopied book from 15 years ago. And her book was about executed women in England and Wales in the 20th century. And she outlined some of the issues that she had in getting her work published. And she puts it in the preface of her book. And she says, during interviews for jobs and while seeking the publisher, her research was repeatedly referred to as a bit unusual. It's a bit off the beaten track. It's obscure. It's history. And I don't know if we really do that. And I think we've come a long way, but I do still think that there is an aspect of that within historical approaches in criminology. And Ballinger went on to cite a few points that she said kind of put paid to these comments. Her book contained evidence of miscarriages of justice. Well, surely that was relevant. It was the 20th century. It wasn't that long ago. This is living memory for many. It was about women and punishment. So over half the world's population are included. And there was already a really sensationalist and rabid public appetite for cases of women who killed. So how was this in no way of interest? Was it really such an obscure and unusual subject? So she ends her preface on the book's journey to publication with the comment that there's a close relationship between modern history and the present, and it's crucial to understand our history of the present. So I'll come back to this idea of the historical research. If we're doing it in criminology, it should tell us something about the present. But first, I mentioned this in the talk that Dave Churchill gave a few weeks ago or a month ago, and it was sometimes very hard to know how to kind of pitch the research in terms of where it got published, which obviously I didn't really consider until I was pretty much done with it. So in terms of book proposals, there was one rejection, which is, we've read your proposal with interest, but it's obviously criminology. It's not really history. And I responded and I said, well, yeah, it is a bit criminology. That's kind of the discipline in which I work, but it's between the disciplines. And they said, undoubtedly, but it's criminology. And I wonder if I'd sent it to a pure criminology publisher, if they would have read it and said, this is not the criminology. And then a response from a journal for the first article that I was trying to get published, which ultimately ended up in Law and History Review, was hilarious, now looking back, where they said, this is a social science article. This is like law or social science. This is not history. The many subheadings, the aversion to combining footnotes, and even the rhetoric. And that is something that I still find in terms of the boundaries between the disciplines of history and criminology, what's accepted and what's expected. And it's also, depending on who you speak to, everything is very much a point of view. So if I was speaking to a criminologist, my work would be, they would see it as entirely desk-based. And if I was speaking to a lawyer, for example, then to them, my work is empirical because I was going to the archives. So they're some of the, I suppose, the issues that became apparent to me after I had done the PhD, while I was kind of moving towards trying to publish some of this research. And my research prior to the PhD was all documents. It was the only research I'd undertaken was the content analysis of the newspaper representation of offending women. So I was used to reading documents for my research. So that was the only experience that I had going into doing the historical work. And I had no idea how to approach the archives. I was really cloudy about it. I only have very hazy memories of the first few trips to the archives. And I think that's because I didn't have a clue what I was doing. And in reading back over my proposal, it was very clear to me that I hadn't been in the archives, because I said I'm going to go to the National Library and look at all the hard copy newspapers. I don't think I was aware that they were online and I could access them online. And in terms of the reference or the archive that I wanted to consult in the archives, I didn't list any because I didn't know what was there. In the end, the vast majority of the sources for the research were from the National Archives of Ireland. For the women who were convicted of murder and sentenced to death, a lot of the material comes from the Department of Justice or the Department of the Taoiseach or the Prime Minister, or Court of Criminal Appeal files for some of them. And these give you an awful lot of information, including information about what happens after a woman has been reprieved from sentence of death. So her stay in prison, and then where and when she is finally released, including very mundane day-to-day things like, so-and-so would like a radio in her cell. And then for the other cases of women prosecuted for murder, the majority of that is a combination of kind of going through the trials record books and finding a woman and then trying to find the corresponding box which had the file in it, and that would have things like the depositions. So you become familiar with the key players. And then going back to the newspaper databases, where you will frequently get the information that you're not getting with a lot of those cases which do not end with a death sentence. The notable absence through this, because for my work, the religious aspect became very important because of where women were sent. And there was no access to any of the archives of the religious orders, which has been kind of an ongoing point of contention with this kind of research in Ireland. And I did, in my naivety, I suppose, try to make contact with the relevant orders, and I gave them the information, and like there was nothing forthcoming. So that's the sources. And one of the things that I kind of now look back on and think is absolutely insane is when I started the PhD, I didn't have a smartphone. I didn't have one until 2014, apparently. So I was transcribing every document that I thought would be useful. And when I went back in 2018 to expand the study, I had a smartphone and I took pictures. I took absolutely thousands of pictures, and I read these at home. And the difference in the two methods isn't just the tech timeline. It was the extent to which in the first round, I was totally immersed. I knew a case before I left the archive that day because I wasn't taking photographs. So I had to transcribe everything. So every case took a very long time to get through. So by the time you were finished with that case, you'd spent a few weeks in the archives just transcribing. And in 2018, I was bringing home all the photographs, and then I was reading them, and then I was like transcribing bits and pieces that were of interest. And I think now I kind of do a combination of both. One of the things, I suppose, about historical research that you're all familiar with is you're navigating a world that you're not familiar with. For me, the legal rules and procedures of 20th century Irish courts was something I was not familiar with whatsoever. So you're constantly attempting to piece together the secondary literature and what you're finding in the primary sources. I have occasionally also considered using software, and I've gotten into the language of coding and the qualitative approach. And I've toiled at one workshop on in vivo, but when it came down to it, in dealing with a lot of qualitative information, I always went, I don't even know if it's a more laborious manual route, but that's what I did. I just had reams and reams of Word documents, and that's how I did it. And I think with this kind of research, occasionally there is a perception that the language of coding and software can make it seem like what you're doing is more objective and you're not just cherry picking cases to kind of prove your point. And I think the caveat needs to be that that's how this kind of research, you're always open to that kind of accusation, regardless of how you're doing it, and that technology isn't necessarily a bulletproof shield for that. Another issue with the archival approach that I found was I was only most of the time hearing the powerful voices, the institutional voices, because obviously that's what the archives collect. It's the voices of the barristers, it's the voices of the judges, it's the voices very, very occasionally of the women themselves. And when we hear the women's voices, we're always hearing them for a purpose. So if they're writing a petition, it's for a particular purpose. If they're speaking in court, it's usually for a particular purpose. And they're trying to achieve an end, and their words are always being mediated by the advice that they're given and what they're trying to achieve. So in my new research, I'm combining interviews and oral histories with archival research, I suppose, as an attempt to bridge that, but that's clearly not always possible. So one of the issues is trying to recover or make space for the women's voices, or for your voices in whatever kind of piece of research that you're doing. And one of the issues also is what we do and do not have access to, which is really important in the Irish context, but beyond the Irish context also. So in the Irish context, we don't have access to the archives of the religious orders, which are relevant to my work. And also, for example, we don't have access to the records from the psychiatric hospitals. And there is, of course, the same rule that after a period, government records should be sent and transferred to the National Archives of Ireland unless an exception can be given. But this is not necessarily how it works, as we all know. In the case of religious organizations, these are private organizations, but in recent decades, they've obviously been at the center of controversy and government inquiries. So for the women in my study, an awful lot of them ended up in religious homes as part of their sentence. So they were serving out their sentences under the broader aegis of the state. So this and many other reasons dictate why, for example, these archives should be open to researchers. And also the question of the false start. The first archivist I spoke to when I went in used the same online system to look for cases that I had, found one document of relevance, and then said, I'm sorry, we must have nothing else. So I think one of my big take-homes was speak to the archivist that has the subject expertise that you were looking for. So one of the articles that I really like on this is Lizzie's article on being reflective in the archives, emotion in the archives. And she says these are not just stories, but these are events in many cases of living memory. And we have to be aware of that. And now we live in an age where our research is not just going out into an academic void, although it may feel like that sometimes. Our research is going out online in ways that are easily searchable through a Google search. And I remember reading this article before I'd done the research or published anything about it, and Lizzie had written about being contacted by the descendants of women that she'd written about in her book. And I thought, oh my goodness, I don't imagine that ever happening to me. And of course it did. People reached out because I had published journal articles or blogs that mentioned a great aunt or a second cousin. So this is the kind of ethical question that we are presented with researching history in the 21st century that we wouldn't necessarily have had in the past. There's also the chance, as Lizzie mentions in that article as well, that you will come across photographs, and this is occasionally very, very shocking. And there are times where you're going through the boxes, in my case, certainly, where you come across things like a shoelace, which had been one of the primary exhibits in the murder case. So these are the emotions, the considerations, the issues, the concerns that all kind of coalesce whenever you're doing historical research on crime and punishment. So I hadn't considered whenever I was starting my research, because in my proposal for the PhD, I had just written, the ethical issues are restricted to those of access. There are no issues of confidentiality, which of course wasn't true. The moment I came to publish, there were questions of, well, are you using the women's names or not? And what's the convention depending on the discipline? So historical criminology was a term that I first became aware of some years after I'd started my research. So I suppose, what does it mean that people have been doing this all along and you haven't necessarily given it the brand of historical criminology? I worked within the vein of a lot of previous work on women who kill, from Ballinger and Seal to Elaine Farrell and Karen Brennan. So work from across a lot of different disciplines, including law and history and criminology. So the work I was doing could have been presented under any number of banners, including Irish studies, feminist criminology, crime history. So how does it fit within criminology? Well, as Churchill kind of writes, criminology isn't strictly ahistorical. It just sometimes feels like that, and it feels like something of a modernist project in the here and now, where we try and fix problems of our kind of contemporary society. And in writing the book, in the introduction, I had initially referred to it as historical criminology, and then I removed it. I'm not sure why I removed it. And I think it's because, in a way that Churchill writes, it's not necessarily a subfield, it's just a way of thinking. I say just, that's a big thing. It's a way of thinking. And it's about applying historical considerations. It's about thinking about historical time whenever you're looking at the topic of interest. So, and one of the things as well, between the boundaries between history and criminology is, with history, I can find that X number of women were convicted of this particular offense. I can find that X number of women received this sentence and X number of women were sent to prison and a certain number were sent to religious homes as their punishment. And then I think where we get into historical criminology and where it kind of veers from history to criminology is where we start to make deeper inferences from the findings. And many of us are working with kind of primary sources, but to that, we're really applying a theoretical perspective that perhaps would not be as commonly used within history. So it's not a subfield, it's a matter of thinking about historical time. So I'm finally going to talk about the book a bit now. Not for very long, because this became a total digression. A total, what is the word? Yeah, this became for me I started to think more kind of reflectively or reflexively about the concerns I had writing the book, or the considerations that I had. And basically 10 years of working in historical criminology, even though I wasn't always calling it that, and what it means on a practical basis. So looking at the cases of women, murder and capital punishment in Ireland, I want to talk today about three kind of very general themes that came from the book. The first is, well, who were the women? What crimes did they commit, and what happened to them? The second, I want to talk specifically about the capital convictions. What about the women who were convicted of murder and who received a sentence of death? What happened to them? And then finally, I want to look at the gendered landscape that these women were conducting their cases in, were being tried in, and were being punished in. So who were the women and what happened to them? Where did they come from and where did they go? So from 1922 until 1964, 292 women were prosecuted for murder. That's probably the right figure. There was a couple of years at the start under the Dublin Commission where things were just kind of recovering from the Civil War. So there's maybe a couple that have been missed, but that's generally the figure. That's pretty accurate. So 292 women were prosecuted for murder, and only 22 of them were ultimately convicted of murder. Of the total number of women prosecuted, the case involved overwhelmingly an infant victim, a child in only 5 cases. And then there were obviously cases of adults as well, but overwhelmingly, the profile of these cases are that they killed their infants aged less than 12 months. And myself and David Doyle have written a chapter for a forthcoming edited book with Emma Mellon and Karen Brennan that kind of looks at that aspect in particular much more closely and kind of makes arguments along the lines of Ireland's refusal and very delayed response to reform the law on infant murder led to this bizarre profile of condemned persons and prosecuted for murder persons through the 20th century, whereby overwhelmingly it was women before the courts being prosecuted for the murders of their infants. And we know from the literature that killings perpetrated by women are different than those committed by men. Women commit fewer killings than men, and when they do, it's qualitatively different. They tend to kill within the family, and they're much less likely to kill beyond the family. And the Irish figures really reflected this, of course, because they are very much kind of profiled by the fact that infant murder wasn't a separate offence at this stage. Through the 20s and the 30s and even into the 40s, the most remarkable trend was very much the stability of the numbers of women before the courts every year. And that really falls off in the 50s and 60s, partly as a function of infanticide law reform in 1949, whereby you have one significant group of women being removed from murder prosecutions, largely. And then you get into obviously the 50s and 60s as well. People have written in the Irish context that it was a policeman's paradise. So there are few high-profile, serious crimes being committed, relatively speaking. So the question of motivation throughout the prosecutions, therefore, really reflected the profile in terms of victim. So the shame and the pressure of having birth outside of marriage was an incredibly compelling reason for many of the women to kill. So the infant victims were almost entirely children that had been born outside of marriage. For those who killed adults, the motivations fell under the usual headings of financial gain, inheritance and land, family disputes, and extramarital relationships. The average woman was in her 20s, but there was a split between infant murder and adult murder prosecutions, whereby the women who were prosecuted for infant murder were much more likely to be a bit younger than the women who were prosecuted for adult murder. And this will be no shock, the women were overwhelmingly drawn from very poor, very marginalized communities. They tended to be the urban working class or the laboring classes, and the women were also very much reflecting Irish society at the time in that they were from rural areas or small towns overwhelmingly. And that reflected as well the motivations to kill. Things like disputes over the family farm feature in quite a few of the killings of adults in particular. So that's who the women were. Of those who were capitally convicted, we kind of whittle it down from 292 to 22 women who are ultimately convicted of murder and receive the mandatory sentence of death. Only one of these women was executed, and that was Annie Walsh, who was executed in 1925 for the murder of her husband, and her co-convicted lover, Michael Talbot, was executed the same day as her. More death sentences were handed down to women from the period from 1922 to 29 than in any other decade after, which reflects, again, going back to the infant murder question, reflects a period of moral panic in Ireland about infant mortality and questions of morality, and saw much more fevered discussion and discourse about what is to be done with women who are having sex outside of marriage and becoming pregnant. And you can see this in the harsher outcomes for women before the courts on charges of infant murder. And looking specifically at the women who are condemned to death, the cases, of course, they mostly deal with leniency and mercy instead of actual death. Only Walsh is executed in 1925. And the number of death sentences in each decade kind of drops considerably. And those women that are death sentenced are almost to a woman reprieved. And in this way, the findings kind of contribute to the argument for double deviance, but in a way that tends to complicate it. So this is the argument that women are punished more harshly than men because they're punished twice for their crime and for contravening their gender. And in the Irish case, there is clearly a form of mercy by gender operating. Of the 22 condemned women, there were 12 infant murder cases. So by this time, there was no chance that any of these women would ultimately be executed. But that left 10 women who'd been convicted of the murder of an adult, and only one of these women was ultimately executed. So that's a 10% chance of being executed compared to about a 50% chance for the men who were capitally convicted in the same period. And it was very much a case that there were cases where on the facts a man would have been executed, but the women weren't. And one of the things that I've written about in the past is this idea of kind of the chivalry that's at play here, albeit very exclusionary, as the concept tends to be, and also the paternalism, whereby you're not just seeing women reprieved in a value-free context. The almost wholesale reprieve of capitally convicted women is very much tied to the inferior position of women in Irish society at the time, and particularly in the decades after independence in 1922, where this is becoming more entrenched through things like a greater kind of crackdowns on contraceptives and on the restriction of women from jury service, for example, whereby women's role is increasingly being confined to the domestic. So the paternalism or the reprieve of women in this context is the flip side of this society, which is increasingly circumscribing what it is a woman can be, and that is increasingly private, not public. There's very much a sense that execution is in no way appropriate for these women before the courts. And this is explicitly referenced in many of the petitions that are written in on condemned women, including comments like the fact that the condemned person is a woman is very relevant. Women are executed in very exceptional circumstances only. And even whenever you get into the 1940s and then into the 1950s, there are still not just members of the public writing in to say, we can't execute this person, she's a woman, but you also have members of government saying, we're not going to execute this person, are we? She's a woman. And so this clemency that is shown to the women is just kind of very much part and parcel of the increasingly hostile environment that women were experiencing in Ireland post-1922. And the flip side of this is very much the fact that you see clemency and you see leniency in terms of being reprieved from the sentence of death. But on the flip side, you see that a lot of women are ending up not in prison, but in religious homes like Magdalen laundries or mother and baby homes or other religious places of detention. And this is very much the case that these are not unique. They're not unique in Ireland. Anna O'Donnell and O'Sullivan write about this. This is not like Magdalen laundries, mother and baby homes. They're not an Irish thing, but the intensity of their use after independence and particularly into the mid-century, that is quite unusual. So if we look, for example, if we take the two cohorts that I have, I kind of separate them in my mind. The 21 women who were sentenced to death but reprieved from death 11 of those were conditionally discharged from prison to a religious home. So this was the condition on which they were released. If they hadn't agreed to go to the religious home, they weren't getting out of prison. And some of the women had spent a few months in prison. Some had spent a few years, others had spent closer to 2 decades. Of the 209 women who were convicted of lesser offences and sentenced to some form of punishment, and these are lesser offences like manslaughter or concealment of birth, or these are cases in which the judge had a lot of discretion for sentencing. So in these 209 cases, almost a half of them end up spending some time in a religious home, and that's an explicit part of their sentence. And it's either tied to a suspended sentence or it's an explicit condition of a probation order. And this was, I mean, this is very much part and parcel of Ireland's current idea of what it knows about itself, if that makes sense. And at the time, the consideration was very much between the idea of leniency in the form of a religious home or the idea of the prison. And the prison was seen as very criminogenic. The worst of the worst were in there, the petty but prolific offenders. And certainly in cases of infant murder, there was an idea that you did not want to send these women who may be first-time offenders, who may never offend again, but you don't want to send them to prison. So they will go to a religious home instead. So you can see judges very much making the equation, and the barristers as well, that a period of time in a Magdalen laundry is very much the lenient option. And this is even though, even at the time, they often carried more stigma than prisons, and they certainly carried a lot of stigma. So to kind of bring this to a very messy conclusion, what does this historical knowledge do for us now? What good is it to us now? One of the things that Ballinger said at the end of her preface was that it very much relates to now. This is a kind of a history of the present that we're telling whenever we do this. So one element of working in this kind of area in the Irish context is that Irish society places an awful lot of emphasis on history, and we're just coming out of the decade of centenaries, where there were exhibitions and new books and new documentaries and many very high-profile arguments between historians about how we commemorate a century of independence and how we go back and commemorate each of those years. But beyond that, the field in which I'm working has also been relevant. The discussion of mother and baby homes, Magdalen laundries has been very much in the news since the late 90s, when the initial documentaries came out, which brought to greater public awareness that these had been misused and that women and girls had been exploited and coercively confined and coerced against their will to spend long periods of time in religious institutions. So is that what makes my work relevant? And if that wasn't the case, would my work not be relevant? Is it historical criminology only if it speaks to the here and now? Criminology is often, I suppose, considered as an applied social science, and I don't see a lot of my own work in this particular description. I don't expect to be able to waltz into a policy review group and say, right, let me tell you how the prisons should be run, because I don't work in that area. But I do think that there is a lot from the historical research, for example, about 20th century Ireland, that we have had to get through to understand where we are now, to see the continuities in punishment and to see the trends and the tendencies in punishment in a national context. And I really don't have a better answer at the end of this. Is my book relevant? I don't know. I enjoyed writing it. But the question, I suppose, about whether historical criminology needs to have contemporary relevance is one that is beyond me at this point to answer. And I would actually like to hear your views on it. And thank you very much. And I'm glad my laptop didn't die.
Thank you so much. That was fabulous. And we are also thrilled that your laptop didn't die. So I will open up the floor to questions. As I say, please do turn on your cameras. Let us see your wonderful faces, and let me know if you've got any questions. Feel free to raise your hand, maybe write something in the chat. Oh, you're on mute.
Inevitably, that was intentional. Thank you very much for that, Lynsey. I quite like the sweep of the presentation, because it's up to you. It's like you set the tone, and I think you set a wonderful tone. When I was putting together today, I was thinking about what to ask, and because I'm so fascinated by this idea of the deviant person in general, because my work focuses on what happens to you even before you're deviant, but this is also interconnected. So my question is two parts, but I try to keep it simple. Why is a study of women's lethal violence so important? Part two, especially for Ireland.
Ooh, and this is why I should have spoken more about the book and less about the other stuff.
No, you're fine. Fine.
So I think women's lethal violence it's so incredibly rare, but I always think that it, and not just me, this is not my opinion, that it throws up the rest of society and the gender roles in society. So when we're looking at that real, like, tiny minority of women who commit lethal violence, yes, we're talking about like a very small sample of women, but the concerns that it raises, the motivations behind the cases in the individual cases, and what we want to do with these women are kind of, you can't separate them from the women's movement of the 20th century, for example, and like things like PMT and battered women syndrome, and what we do with them in the Irish context, the religious sites, the whole gendered landscape of punishment. So it's a tiny thing that just explodes everything, like a lot of stuff that's of interest to me. And in the Irish context, I think I was interested because it's obviously writing against the accepted narrative that was kind of pushed about Irish womanhood post-independence. And I'm not the first to write about this. Elaine Farrell and Karen Brennan have written about infant murder in this context. But in the Irish context, you have this even, I'm always comparing everything to England and Wales. So compared to England and Wales, you have even a slightly bigger explosion of cognitive dissonance, whereby, yes, it's lethal violence, but it's in this Irish context where Irish women are very tightly prescribed. So I kind of think it shows us that.
That very important colonial element, the way that like the othering of Irish women in the context of like what we call UK, and the differentiated treatment. So it's kind of the same thing. Well, not kind of, but it's a consistent thing where when you teach youth justice and you say to students, hey, you need to look at the jurisdictions and to see how they are distinct, the distinctions in the way they treat young people, to understand the conflicts and the fragmentation. So this idea of like the deviant woman, but the deviant Irish woman. It's not just the deviant woman.
Yeah, and kind of talking about the colonialism and the post-colonialism and how you kind of fit that lens onto your analysis. It, like as you're saying with like the Irish case, that has to be a consideration that has to be relevant, because me as an academic, I'm constantly comparing stuff to England and Wales. So was Ireland in the early years of its kind of independent existence. So you can't help but kind of see the historical context, and that shows up broader things.
Mm-hmm. I think so. I don't know a huge amount about this, so I'm hoping I'm just going to drop this in here and Lynsey will pick up on it. But there's also the added element of a lot of the crimes that women would have been convicted of, particularly around infant killing, would have been imported from England and Wales. So I'm thinking specifically about concealment of birth. Like the number of countries around the world that have a concealment of birth offence, and it all comes directly from England and Wales.
Oh, absolutely. Like, obviously, on independence, you have that article of the Constitution which says basically all laws in application at this moment continue, because otherwise there'd be legal anarchy. So you're dealing with what a lot of academics have said is a mixture of very Catholic ideas and concepts with very Victorian ideas and concepts. And that's just a very kind of powerful combination whenever it comes to morality and gender. And as like we know from the death penalty research, that's not just, the Irish context, it's like the death penalty laws in the former British colonies, and it has quite a long shadow. But going back to the chapter that David and I wrote for your book with Karen, this idea then that even though England, Wales like reformed in 22, and then in like again in 38, it took Ireland until 1949 to say, let's stop like prosecuting these women for murder when we know that's never going to happen. Yeah, there are these kind of strange peculiarities. And that was partly as a result of kind of Catholicism, and partly as a result of, well, we have our own kind of workaround solution. So we don't need to follow them, and we don't always want to be seen to be following England and Wales. So just constantly putting it in kind of comparative context.
I wonder if I might take chair's privilege and your final question that you left us on, in terms of thinking about the role and relevance of historical criminology, which I would personally say I think your book is very relevant. So from my perspective, there's no concern there in any way, shape or form. But I did wonder the extent to which one of the key roles of historical criminology, or that perhaps should be a key role, is making better the way history is taught to children and in schools, particularly around these sorts of issues. I'm not sure if that's anything that's ever kind of occurred to you, Lynsey.
No, actually, that hasn't. But that's really interesting. Yeah, I suppose you're taking history and you're trying to give it a more critical bent than would be, which is why obviously it's massively frowned upon by many more traditional historians. You don't want any theory or any perceived kind of political critique in it. But I think, and I think that is actually something that historical criminology can do. And it tends to come at the matter from a different perspective, right? It's not coming at it from on top. It's always trying to come at it from below as much as is possible with the sources in the archives. But yeah, I think that's a really good point. I will, I should look at school syllabus and see where can we insert historical criminology.
Yeah, on that, I was also going to say, and not that public history is really something I've done thus far, although along with Esmery, we have aspirations to do much more. So that's in the planning stages. But I think this issue, first of all, I don't think it matters whether something is as such relevant, because the reason for writing it is the scholarship, but that there can be really strong public interest, I think, probably particularly in certain areas of historical criminology more than others maybe, and that there's a real role there that connects with memory, public understandings, in a way that has much more potential than some very dry areas of criminology, which perhaps would be perceived as kind of very useful. That sounds really disparaging, which are very useful. But it's kind of funny to, I think, in a way, to say, oh, this stuff is too, it's not applicable, or do you know what I mean?
Yeah. And I think, yeah, it's like knowledge for the sake of knowledge. And in what universe is that a bad thing? That's insulting to the concept of knowledge, and to us as academics who are doing it. But yeah, I think as well, I had, in terms of certain areas of criminology which aren't accused of having no relevance, I think grand theory, there's not that much relevance. But people absolutely love on it. It's is where I suppose you find like a lot of the most like sustained, serious debate and engagement. And a lot of the time that's just academics having a conversation between themselves about grand theory that doesn't filter down to kind of policy or isn't particularly relevant. So I see what you're saying, and I agree with your points, and I look forward to your public history with Esmery.
Yeah, okay. Work in progress, but good work in progress. Very good work. I want to just talk about
Big it up a bit, Esmery.
Sorry, no, it's excellent. It's work in progress. Like I'm totally like fist bump. I'm like raising the roof here. Like it's work in progress, and progress being the emphasis here. But I was thinking about identity. And because punishment is such it's so prioritized in this conversation. Because when I talk about this, because speaking of the classroom, I talk about this to students. Sometimes my students, especially my female students, will ask, "Why do you want to be considered for punishment?" Because when you think about women's liberation, one of the major narratives has to do with equal time, equal crime. If you do the crime, you do the time, et cetera, et cetera. So when you try to, I often try to expand the conversation to talk about penalty as something that's quite normal and as a tool for progress, and how this relates to our identity. So those who can punish best can potentially present themselves as the most progressive and the most stable, but punishing best doesn't always mean the most brutal. Yet there's that conversation. So the role of what do you think when through the lens of gender? How do you have those conversations with your students or with anybody with whom you have these about the role of identity in relation to penalty?
I think I was thinking about the students, and then you said students. It's like this is where you have the conversations where you sometimes want to like whack your head against the wall, because there's a perception that I get from them in the gender crime and criminal justice class, which is men are like disproportionately punished. Women should be punished to the same level as men, and we want equality. I consider myself equal, so why am I not being punished as harshly as this man? Like, well, that's not the way we have to go. We don't have like level up. Can we not just like bring it down a wee bit? It like it doesn't occur. And because I don't think I have a particularly good answer beyond the fact that you're like thinking. I tell my students this: you're thinking incorrectly about the problem. You're wrong. Like, let's punish everyone a bit less, and wouldn't that be a wonderful form of equality? And then I get into things like the number of children that end up in care if a woman is imprisoned versus the number of children that end up in care if a man is imprisoned, the types of crimes that women are in prison. And I try to go through all the stats then after my initial reaction of, no, like that doesn't make any sense, you're doing it wrong. And I try and give all of the kind of the contextual, and they'll talk about, you're saying we have formal legal equality. I don't like to be considered as a person who needs special protection. It's like, that's great. And formal legal equality is often quite aspirational in terms of it's hoping to be something and not necessarily achieving something. So yeah, I have arguments with students about this all the time.
I think if you don't mind me coming back in, something I'm thinking about at the moment, so obviously infanticide is my jam, both historically and contemporary, and something I think it's a difficult argument, and it's one that I think feminist criminologists have really struggled with, is looking at the fact that when women do commit crime, and not just infanticide, but actually pretty much most crime, it's often as a consequence of the inequalities that society puts them in, and patriarchy, and the power and control that men often have over their lives as individuals, but also as a collective. And for me, there's an argument there of, well, as a consequence, we shouldn't punish women to the same extent we punish men, because often the crimes that women are committing are not, they don't have that same sense of agency. Now, obviously, you can say that in certain respects to certain types of crime that men commit as well, particularly, you know, crimes related to poverty and disadvantage, absolutely. But other types of crime, like men killing their wives, like, I feel like, yeah, no, let's just throw the book at them. Whereas when women kill abusive partners, you know, absolutely not. But people don't seem to like that argument in any way, shape or form.
No, and I think there's so with capital punishment and the reprieve rates, like exactly what you're saying and what we've been kind of talking about, there's a few calls like now and also historically that why are we reprieving women at disproportionate rates to men? That would seem to be discrimination, and that argument slightly confuses me, or it slightly boggles my brain, I suppose, in that that's literally arguing for the worst of both worlds. Not only are they not necessarily on an equal footing in terms of like societal structure and kind of histories of discrimination and kind of the private personage as opposed to the public personage, not only are they not necessarily on an equal footing, you also want them to be punished as harshly, and that's therefore translating into more harshly in many ways. It's just like, this is literally the worst of both worlds. If we're not, if you, that means that then you accept that they're not, I suppose, on an equal footing in some regards. Yeah.
Which, if someone else wants to jump in, please do wave your hand at me. But that led me to one of the questions I had around you discussing paternalism in the book. And I agree, it's definitely paternalistic, the decision to reprieve women and to not execute them. But I suppose a question I've got about paternalism is it always bad? Because actually, if there wasn't paternalism, women would be executed.
Yeah, it's this it's a necessary evil that does justice in individual cases and overall does harm, but in the individual cases it's necessary because it's maybe the only thing operating in their favor. I don't know, whenever I'm kind of speaking to students about this and they say, but these women killed their children, and I'm like, and that is an inescapable fact. And then I try and layer on the context and the societal picture so that, yes, this is an awful thing, and not as an attempt to kind of downgrade or minimize it, but to say, and it's an awful thing that they did, that they also went through, that they were compelled to do. And so it's really tricky to kind of get this idea of the nuance of it, as opposed to me coming across like a feminist academic, which I am, and saying these women did nothing wrong. It's like, well, I appreciate that there is harm there, there are awful things, but how do we kind of counterweight this with an understanding of what was going on?
Yeah, I think that's so interesting, because I do remember I'm comparing here my time in Canada, my time in Jamaica, and my time in the UK. And it became more, each move became more and more liberal. So Jamaica was the least liberal in terms of bodily autonomy, because it has also to do with colonialism and this idea that, look, we're so good at following the rules. And then we moved to the Canadian context, where I was having conversations with my teenage friends as a teenager about family planning, and access to things like, abortion, for instance, but it was still whispered. It was still a thing that no one admitted to, even though it was a service that people were availing themselves of. And then coming to the UK and having these conversations, living in Belfast in Northern Ireland, about quite openly. I remember the first few times I had them sitting in a cafe, I was like, people can hear us. Oh my God. And the people with whom I was speaking were like, what are you talking about? They were a bit embarrassed that I was so awkward about it. But I think, in retrospect, having to do this research and doing the PhD and doing the more critical analysis, this idea of trying to convince a contemporary 20-year-old of shame associated with pregnancy outside of marriage is almost impossible.
Yeah.
I mean, people are doing like, what's that site called? You know what I'm talking about. No, you do.
OnlyFans.
Sorry?
Are you talking
Yes.
about OnlyFans?
Oh.
It's just the normalization, the sort of relegation of shame. It's still there. It's still very much there, and depending on your whatever small community you inhabit, that as a part of your, I guess, your daily life or like your network, you might get different levels of shame. But this idea of trying to convince a 20-year-old today that something called unwanted pregnancy or shame associated with illegitimacy, being called a bastard, and having that have real effect is a little bit different, even from 10 years ago or 15 years ago. Like today, it's like, no, this is not a big deal. Why is this? Is an issue? But my response to students sometimes, I don't always remember, but when people talk about, there was an article I read about this notion of punishment and gender, and it was basically, the gist of it was, why punish up? Why not lenience down? And I think in the heatedness of the conversation, because we got stuck on the first part, which was, if we are equal, then we should be equally with everything, right? But you try to explain that there's equality before the law and there's equality under the law. There's a difference between the way equality is applied versus the way it's understood, and that we take into consideration context and these other things. So the first consideration is, who made the rule that punishment was essential? Women were not part of it. So now that we are all taking part in the conversation, should we not then basically clean the slate, the board, and start over with the brainstorming about how we should punish? So why decide that we should punish harshly? Because who made that rule?
Yeah, I think and like there's like a lot on that, like the death penalty and the 19th century feminist movement, where they're like, why should we be bound by the rules that we had like no part in making?
Exactly. Who made them?
Yeah, and not just in terms of punishment, but in terms of what's considered illegal and immoral. Like, you know, we didn't make any of those decisions either.
Yeah. And yeah, I always love the quote, and is it Barbara Wooten? It's like, if men, is it Wooten? If men behave like women, like the courts and the prisons would be empty. So we had no part in making it, but we're already rule abiding, not inclined to murder.
Yeah. Well, there's a great article by Laurie Penny. I can't remember which one it was and where it is, but if you Google it, like, if men got pregnant, something like that, and it's so good. There's like one bit where she's like, if men got pregnant, there'd be an abortion clinic on every block, like every street, and abortion would not only be free, but you'd get like a loyalty scheme. There'd be like a beer advantage point scheme for abortion, and you'd get like a free beer and be able to watch the sports while you're having your abortion. And it's like, it's so true. There would be no such thing as anti-abortion activists. Like, they just wouldn't exist.
Yeah.
This is very interesting. I actually think that this is one of those conversations that that's a source of great frustration, but only because we do the research and things seem so obvious to us that eventually we relearn how to backtrack and then take the whomever we're talking to, including students, on the journey, just to say, oh, by the way, you might have missed this because you don't have this like 20 years that we have in addition to however old you are. But it's an important conversation to have, when to say that, all right, you have this understanding, what is your understanding, just to get a sense of why there's this dissonance, this resistance to this notion, this tendency to promote the dark side of liberation as legitimate, as something that, well, now they're free, so now they're going to be bad. We can't. They need to be controlled. You see why they need to be controlled. You see why we need the rules, because they are unpredictable, volatile.
Yeah, another area that is obviously beyond the scope of this conversation, because you'd be here all night.
Sorry.
Another area that I argue with the students about is prostitution and sex work. We have very different opinions about that. So next year, Esmery, let's have someone on talking about that, and then we can all come on and have a big argument.
I have a few people I think would make a really good contribution. Very well versed, knowledgeable about this, for sure.
But I do think, I mean, this really does show for me the importance of historical criminology, because you can't understand any of these debates without appreciating the history of where it's come from. And, you know, traditional history a lot of the time doesn't do this to the extent that we need it to, in terms of bringing it forward and demonstrating the clear connections.
Yeah,
And I think
absolutely.
also sometimes assumptions that things are novel and new, more from the perspective of social scientists sometimes, that things are novel and new that aren't. Like, I think that, that things could be understood differently if the fact they had actually a longer history was sort of appreciated.
Yeah.
I think there's that too.
Yeah, I mean, particularly in terms of the law, but also in terms of prisons, trying to explain, you know, like the notion of, well, of course we should send people to prison. It's like, yeah, but you appreciate that prison only came about because the British Empire effectively started crumbling and we weren't allowed to transport people to Australia anymore. Like, that's why we got prisons. Like, in this notion that there was a collective decision that prison's a really good idea, so let's do it. Like, there was never that. It was the changing of
Prisons are really interesting.
Yeah. So that is one example.
Also, depressingly, do I want to be depressing? But kind of women's imprisonment, I mean, the arguments and the knowledge are very, I mean, you can have articles, you know, academic articles from the 1920s make these very similar points about poverty and the differential nature of women's crime, and there isn't really a need to incarcerate them, and I suppose your classic reformist arguments, and we go for 100 years, we just put more women in prison. So it's like I haven't got a nice point to make on the end of that, sorry.
Depressing. But you have more and more women's prisons, but you have like better prison design. Like, well, that's just fine. I mean, that's a cherry on a crappy top.
I feel like this is just another way of maintaining the status quo. Making prisons, designing better prisons, is just giving your buddy like a contract to like build, and it's job creation for the elite. And it's not responsive to the social needs of like that inequality that contribute to incarceration. Certainly not when it comes to families that are on the margins already and just need like support to not have the whole thing unravel around them. Like, that one thread is loose and that one thread continues to be exposed and until everything unravels. So yeah, on the back of this, I think that ultimately, like, what I get from all of these conversations is the essential importance of history, what it means to not teach history, and what it means to the importance of teaching the young people history. And it's the tool that it represents, even outside of HE, just as some preemptive way of understanding how to learn, how to understand what we've learned in our classrooms in the contemporary.
And Lynsey, as you were talking, I was thinking, I can't even articulate myself very well, but I was thinking weird is the wrong word, but the weird thing about being British, being in Britain, and the moment we're in terms of understandings of history in the sort of public sense and in relation to memory, colonialism and so forth, it's this sort of horrible, weird juncture of denial and silence, that actually, like, hearing you talk about the Irish context would be that, because, you know, there's the celebratory aspect of, you know, 100 years of independence and so forth, and being able to kind of intervene there, and of course, you know, the problematic and ambiguous aspects and all of that, but at least I'm assuming from what you said, there's more of an opening in the public discourse to at least kind of have those conversations, in a way that, I'm not saying there's no openings in the public discourse in this country, that would be wrong, but it's become ridiculous, you know.
Yeah, I think and there is in the Irish context, and I agree with you as well, I'm like Northern Ireland, but obviously orientated towards London just because of colonialism and imperialism, and also that's where the TV came from. So I do think that at the moment that all the critical commentary around British history is like kind of getting to fever pitch, that's the point at which the public discourse just closed off to it. And I think it's for want of a better term, I suppose, a culture war level in the UK now in many ways, and it's hard to get it through.
Yeah,
I mean, depending what it is, of course. Sorry, Emma.
Yeah.
I think there is it does offer an opportunity to give sympathy to cases that, if they're a contemporary case, there's little to no room for that. So I think there is also the possibility to kind of educate about general concepts, so I like thinking about an infanticide case. I think a historical infanticide case is probably more people can understand it and appreciate leniency is needed in ways that it's kind of difficult to explain why the woman who gave birth in a forest and then left the baby to die in 2020 deserves some sympathy and some leniency.
Yeah, that's a good one, actually.
True. Probably, you probably can find that way in. Yeah.
Sounds like we need a podcast, guys.
No, I do. I totally agree with you. 100%.
I think we'd be good at that.
I think it'd be awesome. I have a student who's doing a third-year dissertation on how myths continue to inform or become barriers to women's full participation. And one of the myth of the deviant woman, but it's not just the deviant woman. It's she's taking myths. She's Romanian. She's taking myths from Romania. So if you can imagine the wicked woman in the forest who kidnaps the children and consumes them, that kind of myth, how that translates into beyond secularity, into our contemporary, and how it informs our thinking without our recognition of it. And I wish that more students took those chances, but I know that students do have that knowledge. They just don't really know how to deploy it without seeming a bit silly. So the confidence to sort of step forward and say, I've got this analogy, or I've got this metaphor or this case study, et cetera, and I want to unpack it within the context of theory or whatever you're trying to disseminate in the classroom. But I think if nothing else, these conversations really reinforce the importance of history as a very important link that can be a missing link in our knowledge if we don't take care to secure it, I think.
I would agree. History's good.
History's good. We're running out of time. Lynsey, is there anything you want to kind of say before we?
No, just like Esme, thank you so much. And Emma, thanks for sharing. And sorry, I went on a total mad one and was barely talking about the book.
No, it was great. I think it's stimulated some excellent conversation about some really important points, and we knew the book was already excellent, so we kind of didn't need you to tell us that. So but on that note, we will draw the session to a close. Huge thank you to Lynsey for presenting, Esme for organizing this, and all of the other talks as well. And I'm sure, Esme, you'll be back in touch with everybody to let them know about future talks that are coming up. This session has been recorded, so that I don't know what happens to that, but something will happen with that. And again, I'm sure Esme will be in touch with everybody about that. So thank you very much for coming, and have a lovely evening.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Take care, guys.